Okay, it's working. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests. Welcome at the conference titled Resilience as a Task, How to Help People in Fragile Regions to Cope with Complex Crises. First idea to organize this conference came to our minds already before the Russian invasion to Ukraine. Because we are realizing there is a lot of complex crises in the fragile regions in the areas around the world, and in particular in the European neighborhood, Middle East, Africa, other regions as well. The war in Ukraine only showed us the urgency of debating this issue, and we know that it only added another level of importance to try to move ahead with clarifying how resilience can be supported and what kind of resilience we have in mind when we are talking about people in the difficult conditions. We are also in a situation when the EU itself has to debate its resilience towards the situation. But there are many debates going about what the EU should do inside. But our conference should mostly focus on what it is that we can do in connection with development cooperation and the aspects of what is needed to be done in people outside Europe. Resilience as a task, we borrowed a part of the motto from the motto of the Czech EU presidency, which is Europe as a task, that is referring to the speech of Václav Havel in 1996, where basically he was describing his perception of how important it is to think about Europe. We think the resilience is an issue that needs a similar approach. We have to think thoroughly what it means, how it shall be approached, what it really should be and what should we focus on, because probably we don't want to have a resilient people that will basically sustain anything at any cost. This conference got support of Minister of Foreign Affairs Jan Lipavsky, and it's also held under the auspices of the Czech presidency. We would like to thank to the main donor of the conference, which is DG INTPA, Director General for International Partnerships, which supported the project of the trio presidency platforms from France, Czech Republic and Sweden in cooperation with Concord Europe, that joined forces under the project called Towards an Open, Fair and Sustainable Europe in the World. Now, I also would like to thank the co-donor of the conference, which is the Czech Development Agency, from the grant that was provided to FORCE for the activities that will take place this year. Yes, and now, because time is running, I would like to ask the Deputy Minister of MFA, Mr. Jiří Kozák, to say his words. After him, the Tanya Cox, Director of Concord, will come with a keynote speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Director. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here again, and thanks FORCE for inviting me to open this conference this afternoon on such an important topic of resilience. The Minister of Foreign Affairs is the supporter of this conference. It was mentioned by Mr. Director that it is partially held under auspices of our Minister Jan Lipavsky, who sends his regards. Yesterday evening, I returned from Sharm from the COP27, and one of the things which was mentioned in many occasions was exactly the topic of today's conference, the resilience. And it was underlined by many leaders of developing countries that this is something that we have to really work together. And I'm really happy that during our EU presidency, resilience is one of the key topics, and we've been trying to advocate for action in this matter very frequently. It was mentioned that the overreaching motto of the Czech presidency is Europe as a task, rethink, rebuild, repower. And in external relations, we in particular focus on the world, which is resilient. In the humanitarian and development policy, we have three big topics: disaster risk reduction in relations to fragility and climate security, the humanitarian development peace nexus in practice, and the third one is the participation of private sector in sustainable development. The Russian war to Ukraine has further shaped our priorities in the area of reduction of fragility and resilient building, not least in view of food, energy, and cyber crisis. We have already some results, such as practical guidelines to the Nexus implementation, which will be widely shared with our implementing partners or the first ever Council conclusions on the role of disaster risk reduction and resilience building in European Union external action. We promote implementation of these practical aspects of the Team Europe initiative, as well as in the Global Gateway flagship. We have also addressed the issue of resilience in relations to food security and to climate and environment-related fragilities. We are still open to further inputs for sharing feasible solutions and joint learning of both positive and negative lessons. In this respect, we count very much on you and your experience and on your localized partnerships. A big part of our presidency is keeping a united EU response and enhancing cooperation between national and European level, as well as the actors of government, private sector, and civil society. Therefore, I would like to invite you all to explore the topic of this conference, the resilience on the background of current fragility, with open mind, contribute with your experience, and look after solutions, partnerships, and viable outcomes. You have representatives of Ministry of Foreign Affairs here. They will be here with you for the whole afternoon. The director of the development Deputy Director of the Development Department will be one of the speakers. I've already spoken to the Director of our Africa Department. So they will be here for the whole afternoon, so they will be interested in your output. I have to excuse myself, I cannot be here for the whole conference, but I will be briefed by them. So I wish you success, I wish you a fruitful exchange, and I look very much to the outcomes of today's conference. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to be here with you at this EU Presidency Project Conference on Resilience. According to the UNDP Oxford University report on multidimensional poverty, it was released last month, approximately 1.2 billion people are living in acute multidimensional poverty. Now, that kind of level of poverty, needless to say, has an effect on their ability to be resilient. Do any of you know how many people are living in conflict areas today? You obviously weren't expecting this to be participatory. I promise I won't overdo it. Do any of you know? We've got some experts in the room. More than 10, for sure. More than 500 million. 2 billion. According to Antonio Guterres, so the UN Secretary General, 2 billion people today are living in conflict areas. That's 1 in 4 people, a quarter of the world's population. I know I'm emphasizing this, but I was stunned by this figure. I was like, how? How is it possible? Last year, there were 432 natural disasters. That's droughts, earthquakes, floods, you name it. So these figures just go to show how very important the topic of resilience is, and how many people, a huge number of people, need their resilience to be supported, need to be resilient, and obviously are probably going to need our support in order to be resilient. Thank you. But resilience as a term and as a task, as we're calling it in this conference, is potentially a bit problematic, at least for me. And I'd like to discuss 3 reasons why I find it a little bit problematic, but I'm going to offer solutions at the same time. At least I'm going to try to. So in my preparations for this conference, I looked up the term resilience and where it comes from. And I was actually really surprised to find that this term is thousands of years old. It goes back to before the time of Christ. Now, I'm not going to give you a history lesson, but suffice to say that, don't bother picking it up again, I'm clearly going to be very annoying with this thing, sorry. But basically, this term has always meant more or less 2 things: the force of resistance and the ability to bounce back. Now, in our sector, we've actually added the notion of being able to adapt to situations so as to reduce their impact. So now we use the term resilience to mean resisting, absorbing, accommodating, and recovering from shocks. So with the aim of restoring the situation as it was before. So preserving stability, if you like. Now that leads me to the very first concern that I have. Most of the situations in which people are being required to be resilient are actually also situations where people find that their rights are undermined or even violated, for example, in situations of conflict. But in no way should we ever expect people to get used to or cope with situations in which their rights are violated or undermined. And certainly not in the longer term. People are very adaptable. And that innate ability to adapt is actually what's kept the human species going for so long. It's helped us to evolve. But we mustn't allow a situation in which people's rights are negatively impacted to become a new normal. And I put that in quote marks, new normal. And I make a real point of this because I actually heard, with my own ears, a very senior EU figure some years ago say in a meeting room with many people, not just me present, that people will have to get used to their rights being abused. I actually heard it. And that was one of the scariest moments of my 20-year career now in the Brussels bubble. I come from Brussels. And that actually then brings me on to the second concern I have with the term resilience. Should people actually have to be able to resist, absorb, accommodate, and recover from such shocks? There's a risk that with a focus on resilience, it could lead us to spend more effort and time on adapting than on addressing the root cause of the problem. Because perhaps the problem shouldn't even exist. People maybe shouldn't even have to be resilient to that thing that's happening to them. So I would be arguing, and I hope that maybe we can bring this up later on this afternoon, that we need to be focusing on the root causes of the problem so that it doesn't happen again, Or if it does, it happens less frequently and less severely. Ensuring people can bounce back is not good enough, because they may have to bounce back time and time again, because we don't look at the causes of the issue, like climate change, environmental degradation, massive inequalities in societies. These cause social tensions, conflict, you name it. Now, one option that I'm suggesting is that we all start thinking about taking a rights-based approach to resilience. It is transformative. It means we're going to be trying to empower people. It means we take a root cause approach to things. It's not just palliative. So we, practitioners, advocates, policymakers, funders, we should all be thinking, how can we take a rights-based approach to resilience? Empowering people as rights holders in situations where their rights are going to be undermined. And this is going to imply a number of different approaches. Firstly, prevention. And that's what I'm referring to when I'm talking about addressing the root causes, preventing this from happening in the first place. What is it in the system? Locally, globally, it doesn't matter. What is it that's happening that's causing the issues that we're trying to help people to be resilient towards? Now, let me take an example, and I admit it's an obvious one, but it is topical: climate change. The way the economy functions today, with everything being geared towards creating more and more growth through a focus on high production and consumption, it's the root of climate change. If we're going to be preventing more climate-related disasters and reducing people's need to be resilient, then we're going to have to change the way the economy functions. Now, I know there are ideas out there, like the circular economy, but it's too little, too late, and far too slow. And, just to be a little bit challenging here, policymakers are not really thinking about the fundamental purpose of the economy. They're not challenging the purpose of the economy, which should be to be creating well-being for everybody within planetary boundaries, the limits of the planet. That's why change is too slow. So, on the first area where we all need to be working a lot more, preventing disasters from happening in the first place, we've got a long way to go. Secondly, preparedness measures. I'm going to say something super obvious, but bear with me. People in zones of high risk to disasters obviously need to be prepared for how to cope with them. But what's crucial in that is that we discuss with the people concerned how we're going to respond. Local communities, including women and children, maybe even especially women and children, know what will work best. But I'd argue not enough attention is being paid by officials, the authorities concerned, to involving and making sure that the local communities participate. Part of preparedness is also early warning mechanisms. And the EU, among others, sets quite a lot of store by early warning mechanisms. So the question is, are they also effective at local level? Similarly, huge amounts of time and effort and money are being put in the third area of intervention, which is immediate relief measures, so through humanitarian assistance. Many of you here today are going to be working on that. But what we saw during COVID was that governments are generally ill-prepared for more lasting disasters where the economy, no matter how well or poorly it may be functioning, but where the economy is impacted at scale. And where all of a sudden, small businesses, markets, the informal sector, which are very important in most EU partner countries, where they're hit hard. And in that situation, the nature of resilience took on a new meaning. And we just weren't prepared to deal with that. None of us. nor were we able to provide the relief that was needed. Lastly, and I heard the word mentioned just a moment ago, we're going to need to rebuild better. Now, I purposely say rebuild, not build back better, and I was super happy to hear that you mentioned rebuild, not build back, because we don't want to go back to the status quo ante, even if it's improved. Business as usual, but better? No thanks. That's like plastering over the fault lines in the system. If we again take COVID-19 as an example, the real reasons why people struggled to survive, they were because largely we had millions and millions of people living and working in the informal sector, in the informal economy. Now, people in the informal sector, they are harder to reach. But if you take a continent like Africa, 80 to 90% of the working population are in the informal sector. So it is crucial, if we're talking about resilience, to be looking to where the people are. And when I heard about the EU measures that were going to be put in place to help people through the COVID period, there was nothing about reaching people in the informal sector or the informal economy. So I think we're going to need to challenge ourselves a bit on that. Where are the people that we're trying to support and help be resilient? That brings me to the third tension. So I've already talked about the danger of accepting a new normal, where rights might be undermined, and potentially focusing too much on adapting rather than on addressing the root causes. The third tension is in this term resilience is between stability and change, or evolution. We all know the world's evolving all the time, and change is actually speeding up. But the idea of rebuilding better is not really captured in this term resilience. And it's only partly captured, I would argue, by our resilience programming. Because we obviously need to focus on the practical aspects of rebuilding better, rather than the systems-related aspects, which take far more time and need a real change in attitudes and practices across the board. Resilience doesn't exist in a vacuum. Resilience doesn't exist even in its own right. It's not a paradigm per se. Resilience is linked to sectors, to many sectors, and these sectors are interrelated. If I go back to that COVID example, what started as a health crisis soon became a food crisis, a livelihood crisis, and in quite a few places, an education crisis. And I'm probably missing a few of the crises that were also involved in COVID. Risks are interconnected. So our responses have to be interconnected too. And that means that we need to take a systemic and a comprehensive approach to resilience. I'd like to end with a few reflections on how the term resilience has evolved in EU usage. Because for me, and I recognise I'm an EU policy geek probably, but they're quite significant. And it reflects a more general shift, which might also be happening at national level, but a more general shift in how the EU approaches policy in general. Back in 2012, when the European Commission, and I'd like to stress it was the European Commission, that released a communication on the EU approach to resilience, the focus was very much on people and communities. Resilience was defined as the ability of an individual, a community, a household, a country, or a region to withstand, adapt, and quickly recover from stresses and shocks. So nothing very surprising there, nothing shocking there. By 2017, on the other hand, the European External Action Service, so a different part of the EU, decided to follow up on its 2016 global strategy with a policy on resilience. The EEAS's focus was on state resilience, state and society resilience. People were no longer at the forefront of their thinking, or maybe never had been, but they were not at the forefront of this paper. People had been amalgamated up to a higher level. So those tailored solutions that we know we need to apply, they weren't there. They disappeared. But this was called the EU's strategic approach to resilience. It looked at how a state could adapt to economic, environmental, demographic, or societal pressures. Interesting, societal pressures. Like the global strategy, it focused more on security issues and risk management than on community resilience. Now, personally, I'm not sure that it's helpful to start using the term resilience where a state is concerned, especially when one actually means risk management and security. These security risks that they were referring to covered pretty much anything: cyber, financial, energy, infrastructure, you name it. Maybe we should just call a spade and say we're talking about security in that instance. But in light of the 2017 communication, it's worth thinking about situations in which we would rather not build a state's resilience. When would it be a bad thing? For example, if there's a risk of consolidating an authoritarian regime, a repressive regime, would we want the EU to be building state resilience in that case? What about where there's a lack of democracy, or where the state might be cracking down on people's freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press? There are plenty of these states in the world. Plenty. We can probably think of one where lots is going on right now: Iran. Are these states which we would want the EU to be building resilience? I at least would be arguing that if the EU or member states' governments do decide to strengthen state resilience, then it has to be done with transparent and accountable governance as one of the objectives. To reinforce the enabling environment, access to information, free press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the so-called EU values. A democratic society will necessarily be more resilient. Just as a strong social contract between the state and the population, based on people-centered policies, respect for human rights and the rule of law, will in turn make the state more resilient. For me at least, the most important thing in ensuring that people are resilient is to make sure we fulfill their rights, no matter where the people are, who they are, or what has happened. Thank you.
Sorry. I am quite loud, but that is probably a great idea to have a microphone. So welcome to this first panel, which is indeed just what Tanya was asking for, an introduction to all these crises in the current context. And we are certainly going to try to cover each and every crisis that you potentially missed in your list in the first speech, and some of those you mentioned as well. My name is Åsa Thomasson. I am a policy advisor on development cooperation and development finance at Concord Sweden, which is a Swedish national platform of development organizations. And I will be trying to moderate this first panel of this conference. And I will have to ask you upfront to excuse any errors on my part. I was asked to moderate this session due to a health issue of the person who was intended to moderate. So in case something doesn't come across right, it's entirely my fault and none of it is the panelists, because we have this excellent panel. Okay. And the objective of this first session is a little bit to set the scene. We want to gain insight into all of these severe and multiple concurrent crises that we're seeing in the world today, and we want to dive deeper into their impact on local communities across the globe. We also want to discuss the role of the EU in this context and the role of the Czech Republic specifically in responding to these multiple and overlapping crises and building resilience to them. So we have with us today an expert panel. Here to my left is Mr. Martin Ranseret, a policy officer at ECDPM, European Think and Do Tank. Is that the preferred description? We have Ms. Evelyn van Romberg, who is the head of Oxfam's EU, the Oxfam Brussels office. Next, we have Ms. Marta Úbeda Rodriguez, who are with us today all the way from Brussels as well. So thank you for being here. You're a policy officer at the Directorate General for International Partnerships. Next to Marta, we have Mr. Richard Walker, the Regional Director for Africa in the organization People in Need. Got that right. And last but certainly not least, we have a representative here of the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ms. Hanna Volna. And Ms. Volna is the Deputy Director of Development, Cooperation and Humanitarian Assistance, if I'm not mistaken. Welcome all. And the layout of the panel is that I'll give each panelist up to 7 minutes. I'll actually clock you on 6, and I have a little alarm because I'm a very fair moderator, so I'll start waving my little finger when it's time to wrap up. And after that, we will have a little discussion in case the panel are curious about their interventions. But we will absolutely save time at the end for questions and comments from the audience as well. So please do not hesitate to take mental note of your questions while the panelists are speaking. And then I'll ask someone, pass the microphone around so we can have some questions from the audience. Okay, but first I will give the word to Evelyn, because I do believe that you have some information that will truly achieve our first objective of assessing the impact and the scope of all of these global crises that we're seeing.
Thank you so much. Is this working? Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you also for raising the bar so high. Thanks for that kind introduction, and also congratulations to Force and for leading on organizing this very important conference today and tomorrow. I'm really excited to contribute. So I'm going to speak briefly about 4 global crises that we are facing and the consequences for local communities, and in particular the consequences in terms of food security. I'm going to throw a lot of numbers at you, apologies for that, and it's also not going to be a very uplifting presentation, but in the end I'm going to hopefully also give some positive notes on how to address and how to move forward. So the first crisis is the hunger crisis. Across 53 countries in the world, there are almost 200 million people that are suffering from acute hunger. So in East Africa, for example, there are 47 million people in dire need of humanitarian aid. In West Africa, there's 27 million people facing severe hunger because of enormous drought in the region. So taken that together, that's 6.5 times more people than the entire population of the Czech Republic. In Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya, historic levels of drought, again, has caused every 36 seconds one person to die. And by the end of my presentations, that will be 12 people. And by the end of this conference tomorrow, it will be 2,800 people. And these are all individuals, and I think that's important to take into consideration. So the war in Ukraine, it was already mentioned, has made very clear how fragile the international food system is. The food crisis that we are seeing is made worse by the war, but it's not new. So the war has added an extra layer to a food system that's already failing. A system where farmers are producing far more food than we actually need, but where this food is not reaching the people that it needs, or where people can simply not afford to buy this food. The Oxfam Syria country director was in Brussels last week to address EU officials about the conflict in Syria, and he told me that food prices have increased in the last year since the war with 92%. 92%. It's almost twice as expensive as it was before the war. And it means that people who are making 3 times as much as the minimum wage are still not able to afford basic food items. So, a crisis in our global food system. The second crisis, and I think that is some that we all know very much about, is the climate crisis. And of course, we're all following the news of what's happening in Egypt now with the COP. But the climate crisis is also pushing 16 million people to crisis levels of hunger. And the sad story is that those people who have contributed the least to the climate crisis, so people in Central America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, they are suffering the most from the crisis. Then the third crisis is conflict, and Tanya was already referring to how many people in the world are in a situation of conflict. But it also continues to be the primary cause of hunger for almost 100 million people in 53 countries. So Afghanistan, Somalia, South Sudan, Syria, Yemen, some of the world's worst hunger hotspots are also countries that have been torn by conflict for years. And women or girls are hit the hardest because they are either eating the last or eating the least. And then the fourth and the last crisis is that of inequality, which has been rising sharply again in the last years, particularly due to COVID. So in 2021, at the end of the year, there were 750 million people living in extreme poverty, which was a rise of 100 million in that year alone. And meanwhile, the rich are getting richer. So the 10 most wealthiest people on earth saw their wealth increase in 2021 with $400 billion. So that's a 4 with 11 zeros. And that's the same as the UN Global Humanitarian Appeal in the year, 11 times. So we see that, again, in the last 2 years, but also due to the war in Ukraine, that multinationals have profited enormously. So tech companies, pharma companies, energy and food companies, over the back of ordinary people who here, but everywhere, see that it's very hard to meet ends because of the inflation. So we have a broken food system. We have record levels of protected conflict. We have an escalating climate crisis and sharp increases in inequality. And these 4 crises are pushing millions of people in extreme poverty and hunger. So that's a bleak picture, I know. But there are also ways to act. And ODA, Official Development Aid and Development Cooperation, is one of the most important ways to avoid crises from spinning out of control and to address the root causes that was also mentioned by Tanya. And what we have to do is act much, much earlier. We need to have a development system that builds resilience that's the key word, to shocks before the humanitarians come in. Because once humanitarian crisis or once humanitarian action is needed, it means that the crisis is already on their way and people are already dying because of hunger or food security, insecurity, or conflict. So what we need is investment in local food systems, local food production, education, health, protection services, all these things that will build resilience. We also need to make sure that humanitarian funding is keeping pace with the needs, because we are seeing that even though humanitarian donors have done an extraordinary thing last year, the needs have never been more further away from what is actually being funded. And we see that huge amounts of funds are made available for the war in Ukraine, and rightly so, but it also shows that with political will, there are actually funds available. So we need that same political will for humanitarian crises elsewhere. We also need to make sure that development aid is actually spent and used for the right purposes. So that means that it's not being inflated by spending it on in-country refugee costs. It's something that we're seeing a lot happening in European countries now as a response to Ukrainian refugees fleeing the border and coming into European countries. And we saw the same happening in 2015 and 16, where an average of 11% of development aid was being spent on in-country refugee costs for hosting Syrian refugees. And that's 11% of ODA not being spent on fighting poverty and inequality. So finally, last sentence, we also need to invest in climate resilience and adaptation and in sustainable food systems. I think it can be done, but I also really believe it must be done. Thanks.
Indeed. That is quite a harsh, bleak picture of the global situation that we're in. And I would like to give the word to Richard Walker to hear maybe a few examples from you of how are these crises playing out in a local context? What's the impact that you're seeing in your work? A few examples.
Are we working? Yes? Okay. Let me first apologize, because in fact I shouldn't be sitting here at the moment. This spot was reserved for PIN's Resilience Program Manager from Angola. But unfortunately, even with a lot of, let's say, advanced planning, the embassies were still not able to manage the visa process. So maybe this is just one example of how difficult it is to get the input of local voices into policy agendas and development forums. So please imagine that you're not looking at an old, fat, bald guy. You're now looking at a young, fit, very good-looking Angolan guy, and maybe that will help get the message across a little bit more. I'd like to thank the organisers, however, for at least attempting to give the priority to the inclusion of, let's say, our voices from the field. And today I'll try to do my best to speak on behalf of Bernardo. Complex crisis generally requires complex solutions. And I think, as we've heard already from Tanya and also from Evelyn, just the terminology around resilience is sometimes confusing and complicated in itself. I asked a year or two ago one of our colleagues in Ethiopia how they get this quite complicated sort of discussion within the communities and whether they actually understand it. And her response is that they use the analogy of a chair. A chair requires 4 legs to stand on. If one of those legs, and she said, is slightly eaten by termites, then it might look great, everything's still there, but the slightest push will make it fall to the ground. And her response then is, when we talk to communities, we talk about these legs as the different sectors where the communities have needs, and therefore try to attempt integrated programming that addresses all of those needs concurrently. Her words really resonated a lot in my recent visit to DRC. I just returned at the weekend. I had a good opportunity to speak with many of the heads of delegations, the international donors and partners. And one of the repeated topics that was coming up was not only about the lack or the reduction of funding, but their need to focus very carefully the funding that they have to ensure that they get the greatest possible impact. This is very logical and quite obvious. The difficulty was that that focus very often became a single sector. And we want to geographically cover health, but we're not going to necessarily touch anything else. And I think when you look at the analogy of the chair, of course, we might have a very strong leg of health, but if education is falling down, wash or livelihoods is falling down, then again, we're not actually building resilience, we're just building some strength within the system. Under these conditions, of course, communities are less likely to get the appropriate support that they need, therefore. And if support does come, it comes very often in a single sector approach, which again is not necessarily building the resilience that we're looking for. We're already seeing increasing poverty, as Evelyn explained, increasing malnutrition particularly, which is of a concern for us, and food insecurity across the majority of Africa and many other regions and countries across the globe. These are drivers, as we know, for social unrest and, to scare the EU a little bit, a lot more migration than is happening at the moment. We've also seen, again, pointed out that given strong political will, enormous resources can be mobilized extremely quickly, as is the case with Ukraine. And we need to see the same commitment to meet the challenges of some of these global issues. Otherwise, to be frank, the communities that we are here to support face a very bleak future indeed. Mechanisms such as the TEIs should allow improved collaboration and alignment of donors' agendas towards common programming and hopefully address some of these other legs at the same time. And coordination of that, of course, is extremely important. But let's be really clear, it's the communities themselves that are the first ones to face the brunt of these changes, and they're the first ones who have to adapt and respond to it. And therefore, even though coordination is key, under the grand bargain, we need to make these coordination mechanisms as simple as possible, as streamlined as possible, and to make sure they take as little money out of the system as is possible, considering the funding gap. It's quite a challenge, isn't it, really? Hopefully this forum will allow us to unpack a few of these issues, and maybe we'll find a few hundred silver bullets to address some of the problems that we've got. If I may, I'd like to finish by just reading a letter that Bernardo has sent, so you would have things in his own voice. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Bernardo Dumbo, and it's a great honor for me to speak today with all of you. Such an inspiring company. I'm here on behalf of people in need, specifically the Angola Country Programme, where I work as a resilience program manager. However, I would also say I'm here to represent all Angolans and the issues they face nowadays. Many of these issues are linked to a very complex emergency crisis. Angola is facing the worst recorded drought in 40 years. In the region where I come from, in the south of Angola, there are more than 2 million people affected by this drought, and nearly 500,000 of those are children under the age of 5. When we talk about Angola globally, the numbers are even worse. More than 7 million people facing food and nutrition insecurity, acute insecurity, due to climate shock, and 4 million of those are children. The picture above, this is Adelia. She's 75 years old and lives in Chicumba, which is in the southern part of Angola. It's one of the most critical places affected at the moment by the droughts. Every day, she walks a minimum of 10 kilometers to the river where she can collect water for her family of 8 people. She can't carry enough for 8 people, so very often some of her grandchildren have to go with her. When they do that, because of the distance, they're missing school. The family uses the water for their farming, their cooking, but also their drinking, and it's an unprotected source. So they often suffer from health-related issues, and these diseases contribute to increasing the malnutrition that she already sees in her youngest children. In Angola alone, and Angola is not one of the countries where we recognize as the key crisis, Yemen, Afghanistan, etc., many others. But this is to try to emphasize the point that there are many other countries affected that are perhaps not under the radar at the moment. There are 7 more men fairly based on real identified needs and not on political or trade agendas. We need to pay a special attention to women and girls, the elderly and disabled, and people with less opportunities. And we need to jointly improve, and this is probably the most important, how we listen to communities' ideas and their priorities and work hand in hand with them to find real and sustainable solutions. And I think that in this regard, we should still do more. We should do more so that all these people I talked about do not need to suffer in the future. We should do more so that people living in countries like Angola, countries that contribute far less to the climate change than the developed world has, can live in peace and dignity. I trust that in this forum we will be able to find some of those solutions. Thank you.
Thank you. And with this, we thank you and Mr. Bernardo Dumba, and I hope that he gets a chance to look at this online, even if the visa processes were not with him. And I hope that this provides food for thought of how the EU indeed can provide more and also better support in these situations. And speaking of better, I'd like to hand the word now to Mr. Martin Rosseray from ECDPM, and I believe you have been working on some issues that, you know, how different actors are also able to work to address these crises, and you worked quite a lot on the role of civil society and challenges faced by them. So it would be interesting to hear more about how can different actors work better together maybe, and what are the challenges facing different actors in trying to address these crises.
Thank you. Is this working? I think so, yes. Yeah. Thank you, Asa, and thank you to the organizers as well. It's a great pleasure to be here, and the previous speakers have been a little bit demotivating or disheartening, but still quite inspiring. I've been asked to contextualize a little bit closing civic space and the implications for civil society support in a way to make a bridge towards the second part of this panel, which I understand is more policy geared with our representatives here. I will be tapping on some research done at ECDPM, indeed, and a lot of conversations that were not as part of any of that. The bigger picture, if you want, of closing civic space is that we are globally in the what we call the third wave of autocratization. Academics like this kind of characterizations. Basically, it's a new phase where we have an erosion of abilities of societies to claim better governance and increased polarization in societies, etc. And the bad news is that it's a global one that is characterized really almost everywhere by reduced abilities to exert rights of associations, freedom of speech, possibility of being present in the public sphere and getting funding, indeed, and indeed also the integrity of individuals that are serving some causes. That's sort of for the bad news. The good news is that, as its name says, a phase. It's also a phase. It's a moment, and it will not last forever, and there will be better times. And maybe that's a little push that I can say, maybe responding to Tanya's presentation on resilience is a paradigm that can serve us in the sense that some things will also be just about resisting for the time that it takes. Not saying that it is normal to be able to be forced to resist all the time, but that it's about hanging on until there are bluer skies, let's say. So that's the sort of half full glass, if you want. Then a couple more points in terms of characterizing the changing civic space, the closing civic space. I'm using purposefully the word changing because indeed it's also not necessarily that it is not possible to mobilize and make use of the public sphere. It's also that different actors are welcome to it. We've seen, for instance, that now that the sort of 10 years brackets of democratization in Tunisia are sort of over, it's different types of actors and conservative ones that can take the street. But that doesn't mean that it's not possible to take the street anymore. And another sort of even more extreme example of closing civic space and in a polarized, very fast polarized society would be in Ukraine. I was really interested by the process that followed the release in last August of this Amnesty International report decrying a suspected human rights violation by the Ukrainian army. I think more than 30 reports by Amnesty had already decried violations by the Russians, and for the first time it was about the Ukrainian army. And there was such a massive outrage in international media and especially in Ukraine. You cannot say that. You are helping the propaganda of Putin, etc. You need to tone down. Have you had the right methodology, etc. And to me, that's just an example of that. That's a more polarized society that then stops being open to this kind of challenging and of what is being done. And in fact, it is dearly needed. Any society at war is sometimes going too far and needs to be held accountable. So that's sort of to contextualize a little bit the civic space in general. I have maybe two more points on that, saying that just the digital technologies are playing a very important role in this context, as demultipliers of both the problems and the potential solutions. I will not go into details of examples from NSARS to Bring Back Our Girls, etc. And the fact that when you have a social movement that mobilizes around the hashtag, you can also just kill it by closing the internet, as indeed Nigeria has done last year. Or in fact, changing the rules of a social network, as Twitter seems to be doing these days, will certainly also have an impact on that. And finally, the fact that informal actors, the ones that are not structured civil society, registered NGOs, etc., those organizations that are more out of the radar are becoming increasingly important in this context of the closing civic space. And women's movements have played very, very important roles in COVID recovery in particular, and many other areas. So that's a very diverse civil society that is pushing and sort of supplementing the states at times, replacing it, calling it to account, playing all those different roles, and that makes it sort of more important than ever to support and fund civil society. I have sort of a final call for sort of looking at donors and especially the two donors that we have lined up for as speakers today. Are there the tools there, the methods in order to address the sort of a number of challenges that now are with this closed civic space, such as addressing the right people, localization. Okay, we've heard about this one in previous presentations. Avoiding extroverting those efforts, avoiding turning grassroots movements into service delivery for donors. How do we avoid fragmenting the efforts to the extent that then some organizations have to report to many different donors and don't have any time anymore to just think about what their own constituencies want? How to avoid abandoning the promising initiatives that have been already supported, especially on the face of repression, when they might need not only more funding, but also diplomatic support and all the other soft forms of support. And how to avoid delegating the risks in case indeed there is a crackdown, an NGO is not able to deliver what it's supposed to. Is there the flexibility to allow it to adjust and not offload the risks from the donor towards the grantee? So that's my little final challenge to donors. And the EU is extremely important in that context, as sort of setting the rules of the game for a big part of the world through sheer size and also through what it does, and the presidencies. Thank you.
Indeed, an excellent convener and example to many of the member states. And And this was a brand new crisis that you brought to the table, the autocratization and the crisis for democracy, and the polarization of the public sphere that we're seeing in so many partner countries, and also within the EU, the democratic values are being challenged as well. But so we've heard about these number of crises, conflict, how many people it's affecting, and now I hope to hear from Ms. Marta Úbeda Rodriguez from the Directorate General for International Partnerships of the European Union. What can the EU do, and what can DG IMPA do in the face of all these global crises? What are some of the challenges for development cooperation from the EU and member states today?
Thank you. Is this working? Yes, it is working. Well, first of all, thank you to the organizers for the invitation. It was not supposed to be me, it was supposed to be our director, Kira Adamu, to be here, but unfortunately she couldn't make it last minute. I also wanted to thank the other speakers for the very, very interesting contributions. I don't even have a space in my paper anymore to take notes of all that you're saying. I'm gonna have to borrow these new notebooks. Precisely, we were invited by the organizer to talk about the role of the European Commission and also concretely of the Director General of International Partnerships on how we address the consequences of this crisis in local communities, because indeed, as the other speakers have already raised and we all agree on, the international community has a responsibility to help and support these concrete communities and individuals to face this crisis. And larger scale crises have something is that they challenge multiple interests. We're seeing interconnected crises, and this multiple interests and equities have a way of pulling together people to the table, allies and rebels alike. And in the EU as one of the largest international aid and development donors, we have the responsibility role to invest in this local resilience building and to ensure long-term development and decrease dependency on foreign aid. The way that we've been doing this, it's through a comprehensive and sustainable approach, is the humanitarian development peace nexus approach that was mentioned by the representative of the minister before. It's one of the priorities of the Czech presidency. It's something that we've been working a lot together on. And the way we conceptualize it is as the approach that has as ultimate objective to ensure the well-being of affected populations under protection. And I underline again affected populations, because we all agree in that that's a fundamental dimension and the one that has gathered us together here today. And the second objective is precisely to build on the resilience. It's something that we have very present. So this approach consists on strengthening the collaboration, the coherence in which like this humanitarian development and peace actors work together, and capitalizing on their comparative advantage, depending on each of the specific context, depending on each of the specific crises and the community, the individuals that we are addressing. The way we do it, it's joint analysis. We do it through coordination mechanism. We do it by doing joint planning, in which we decide for contributing to collective outcomes, and we're relevant also with the specific financing mechanisms. And as says, we do all of this together with humanitarian development and peace actors. Our role as Director General for International Partnerships within this, as the development cooperation arm of the European Commission, has had a reshaping in the last year with our new financing instrument with NDC Global Europe. Why? Because NDC Global Europe, first and foremost, focuses on tackling the root causes, that it's something that has been coming up in all the interventions and that we all agree much on, and also a focus on mainstreaming that resilience. We believe that our role in the Nexus and the Nexus per se should be based on this analysis of root causes, and something that has already been raised on not only responding to needs, but going from a needs-based approach to a rights-based approach. How do we do this? And NPA, we have, NPA is the way we call Director General of International Partnerships, for those that are not acquainted with the EU jargon, which sometimes it's very messy. The way we've been doing it, it's reducing poverty and hardship in 3 dimensions that also have been raised by the other panelists, preventing the emergence of crises, managing their consequences when they occur, and also building resilience to shocks. And also because the effects of the crisis worsen with chronic fragility and the way these crises affect these local populations, our priorities in fragile and context countries for this financing period focus on 4 dimensions. First one is the strengthening the rule of law. Second one is democratic participation. The third one is human rights. And the fourth one is promoting sustainable development opportunities. And that being said, this is a bit of a very small picture that I can put into 6 minutes of how the EU and more particularly the INPA is committed to work forward, to take the work forward to help these local communities. And we really believe this is a great opportunity for us to learn from you, all the expertise you have and being in the front line and take the lessons back to Brussels so we can keep working on this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Marta. And I was going to say now I have here a very important player at the moment within the EU as well. The Czech presidency is afoot. And so a little bit thinking of this, I would like to ask Ms. Hanna Volna to maybe reflect a bit on what can, both as a member state, what can the Czech Republic do, and how can you adapt your development assistance to be more effective in this context of global crisis, but also what is your experience now of how can the presidency influence the EU in this effect?
Yeah, thank you. So it's a bit difficult to be the last one, but I will try. So first, I would like to say you can see that this is the project of the triple presidency, and we have like a difficult partners because we have France and Sweden, especially in the development cooperation, 2 very, very big countries in the development cooperation with long-term experience and with a very big commitment and with many instruments in place and also big influence on the EU institutions because they are big partners. And we are, compared to both of these countries, much smaller, much newer, and much powerless partner also for the EU institutions. So, and but it was not that we thought that there is nothing we can do in development cooperation and humanitarian agenda because we have both of these under one roof in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We think that our comparative advantage is that we are quicker because now we can hear in many countries, even in Ukraine, there are many promises, but we are very, very slow in the EU to deliver. So one thing we try to do is to be faster in the processes and try to find some, like from the words and from the council conclusions to real implementation. And it was already mentioned by our deputy ministers, so we took simply up in the EU the big processes like approaches, the triple nexus approach and the resilience approach, etc. And we tried to do it more practical by partly, and now I can also relate to the ECDPM challenge, partly to use our real experiences from the field, because our development cooperation is small. It means that we do not provide budget support and we provide almost always direct assistance to local communities and to local contexts. So we also have local feedback and local knowledge. Not only we as the ministry, of course, our partners, our many here sitting partners. So we tried to look on the triple nexus with the eyes of simply the countries, because we have horrible results of our 20 years in Afghanistan, 50 years in Sahel, where we simply, for instance, Burkina Faso, they asked us, they approached us in 2 or 3 years that they are really in danger. And what has happened? Simply, we let it happen. The changes, the negative changes in this country. So we tried to approach the triple nexus and look into the gaps. And we tried not only in bilateral efforts, but we also in cooperation with INCAF, the International Network for Conflict and Fragility, which has a big data sets for many years. So, and we try to operationalize these data sets in EU policies. And what we discovered, and what of course we cannot manage as 6 months presidency, but we started, is that we have a quite good cooperation in humanity and development in fragile settings, but we have no cooperation between development and peace. It's simply that development always stops when there are fragilities and conflicts, etc. And with all the figures we can hear here, so perhaps it's quite clear that it's not the way forward, that the development cooperation simply stops. So we try to discuss in the EU what we can do, and even now with the new instrument, which also has a fragility part, what we can do and which ways and instruments we can use so that the development cooperation doesn't stop in difficult and fragile contexts. That's why we also highlighted very much fragility and anti-fragility. So resilience also as anti-fragility, reduction of fragility. For instance, in the mentioned Council conclusions on disaster risk reduction in relation to fragility and climate security. And it's also because we, of course, are very much aware also of the use of resilience in the EU, different use of resilience inside of the EU policies. There's another resilience in the security policy. It's more our resilience. And there's another resilience in development and humanitarian assistance. And we also try, back to ECDPM challenge, we also brought to the table the diplomacy for Nexus, especially humanitarian diplomacy for Nexus. And it's also a big issue challenging the mandate of humanitarian assistance, development cooperation. But again, we think that we need really also the diplomatic part, not least to be able to communicate with local partners, give them voice, because it's there are channels, diplomatic channels where we can do this, and networking. Yeah, so there are many, many points we started. Some of them we will also develop into some results, and some of them we also count on Sweden that we will continue. And especially it's really about transforming. If something doesn't work in the development cooperation, we shall try to transform it into something which would work better. Yeah.
I thank you very much. And I think that a common thread of several of the panelists has been this, one of the aspects you raised of this lack of coordination or a tendency of seeing things as sort of one sector or one thing. And I'm wondering to turn that around, and just from all the different places where you're placed, like, what would be ways of working, or what would be, like, if you could make a wish, or if you could look at sort of not just the problems and the crisis, but also like the opportunities, like what would be better ways of working, or what would be like opportunities of finding these possible legs of the chair or coordinations between different parts of development cooperation and different actors, which would make it easier to really help local communities face the crisis and build something from the bottom up. Does anyone want to start? Some opportunities? Yeah, please.
Is it working? Yeah, no? Okay. For example, coming back on, as I was commenting on before, the different tools or steps that we have to operationalize this collaboration between humanitarian development and peace actors, one of the principal ones is precisely coordination mechanisms, and doing a bit of autocritic statement. Something that we've realized is that we have more and more coordination mechanisms in country with partner organizations, implementing organizations, but many of these are at national level, what we were saying, so something that we are really insisting on trying to improve on. It's involving more local civil society organization, local authorities as well, because when we talk about local communities, of course, the individuals, but also the community leaders, and it's something that we're really trying to insist on. So I would be very eager to learn from any of you if you have like good practices examples. It's something that is always very useful for us, and that we are seeing, starting to see more here and there, and where we want to build on more.
Mm-hmm. Do we have any experience on the panel? Maybe one of the speakers from civil society, like what, does anyone have any experiences of coordinating with the EU or other donors, or working together in the field, or trying to work in these kinds of challenging environments as well with shrinking civic space? I'm just thinking, what are the ways forward in trying to break the cycle of some of these crises, and any thoughts? Yeah, Evelyn?
This is better? Yes. Thanks. Thank you. About the role of local actors, and it's already been mentioned by a couple of us, but I think that that's really where the key to success is, and to make sure that local actors are able to respond in all of the crises that we are mentioning, also because they are facing the highest risks. This has also been mentioned in the with civic space decreasing in many countries, in many conflict countries, in many countries where there is a climate crisis, in countries where climate summits are being held. And one of the things that is really important is what we as Oxfam think, but what I think most of us agree on, is that donors really provide direct support to local actors, including financial support, because these organizations are the first to arrive or are already there in this context, and are also the ones that stay when big UN agencies, but frankly also big INGOs like Oxfam move on to the next crisis. So funding for local NGOs, for local civil societies, including women-led and women rights organizations, I think is key. And all of this has already been discussed. It's part of the grand bargain that was mentioned by one of the speakers, that 25% of all funding should go directly to local organizations. And in the development area, we see that this is happening more and more, which is really great. And I think that's something that, as a sector, we can really be proud of and need to build on. In the humanitarian sector, this has not been met at all. 97% of all funding still goes to the big players, so that's mostly big UN agencies, and I think that there's really an opportunity for chance there, and also really an opportunity for the huge donors, national and regional, like the EU, to not only lead the way, but to also push each other in increasing that number.
Yeah, but I think also, I mean, I think this is an issue that has been discussed a lot, but at country level, we're also in a situation where it's hard for, you know, an EU DG IMPA unit in Brussels to know the, you know, like this is a strategic community to be working on. Like, I'm thinking about opportunities. Which actors to you are best placed, or are there any other good practices of dialogue at country level, or looking at different types of partnerships there? Richard had some idea.
Yeah, I was going to go back to your initial question in terms of the coordination mechanisms, and I think this also comes down to not just EU, but the member states' own programs, because they are developed by the state itself for whatever reasons, whether there are some political agendas, trade agendas, other issues there. they're not developed in collaboration with other member states to provide a comprehensive budgeting perspective on funding the needs within a particular context. So the coordination then becomes quite complicated in trying to sort of marry often overlapping agendas so that this whole space is covered, and this is where we often see the gaps. Maybe we have to rethink a little bit the way in which let's say the international donors put together their programs by starting from the needs and collaboration rather than trying to do the coordination after the bull has already left the shed or whatever.
So allowing local communities to adapt perhaps a little bit more to their real lived problems and crises at the local level and a little bit less to donor agendas or conflicting donor agendas sometimes. Okay, did we have anyone else who wanted to comment on that, or should I move on to the, did you want to, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so solving basically policy coherence and policy coordination in one go. Interesting, yeah. Well, certainly getting there. Yeah, I have to preach a bit for my own chapel. Say research is needed in order to be to have context-adjusted sort of approaches, and so not make one-size-fits-all programs and replicate, okay, since this seemed to work and project a good light on us as a donor in this country, then let's do the same thing in that other country, etc. So just going beyond that that sort of natural urge to because it is efficient indeed to just replicate. In the case of youth delegations, I've worked with a few of them, and I think in many cases the same sounds were coming from them, which is we sort of know what we should be doing, but we don't have the time because we have too many internal processes and too many things are encumbering our pipeline. And so that to me, that's one message that I thought I should relay here in terms of how to engage and make partnerships, etc. And maybe finally, a bit building on what you said, Richard, it can be about not, let's say, when different donors have different reasons for being in a field, and then they try to coordinate ex post, or when they have already agreed on their own timelines and their own funding, it will be very difficult to combine all that. And I've seen that with the EU delegation, sometimes trying to take a coordinating role when it was really way too late. And so I think there are very promising sort of directions possible using Team Europe initiatives, for instance, to try to do this better. But maybe also something more provocative, if there are different member states on the same field in the same country, they should just agree that one of them has to leave that area and distribute labor much more forcefully, so that as to simplify things and each have sort of more substantial investments in everything that they are doing, instead of spreading themselves too thin.
Yeah, I viewed some initial agreement there from Honorable Naso, please.
Yeah, actually, the leaving some sectors, it has happened in several countries. In our priority countries, that several donors left some sectors, including us, that we also left some sectors if there were bigger donors working there and no real needs for us staying in the sector. So the sector coordination is working quite well under the joint programming, at least for EU countries. But I just wanted to say, to tell you one just current example, because we have now our colleague in Zambia on a programming mission, because our bilateral programs are 2018 to 2023. And in Zambia, so there is a Team Europe approach-led process by the delegation of the EU, where already Germany highlighted that they will put their bilateral program under the roof of the Team Europe program, and we are trying to do the same. But of course, then we need partly to know what the EU would do as the whole, but also partly be sure, and it's the problem with Team Europe initiatives, that the country, that Zambia is aware of the joint program and aware of the networks behind the program. And it's perhaps a bit problem now. So we are now discussing just now in Zambia how to do this.
Yes, and looking at the whole picture, I'm turning to the audience now and asking you to like really think hard, because in just a second I'll let the audience in on a question. But I want to raise one more question, because we've talked about really difficult context, fragile states, conflict, food systems breaking down, all of these things, which tends to be affecting those most in need, very marginalized groups, the least developed countries and conflict countries, all of these crises a lot harder. And I'm wondering, speaking of the EU and combining Nexus approach, working on resilience, if we look at the relationship that the EU have now with many countries in Africa, for example, a lot of what we see when the commissioner is traveling through Africa, we're seeing this promotion of like big investments or future, or mutual relations, trade opportunities, etc., which is in practice very rarely available to the most exposed countries, the most affected countries, the least developed countries. I mean, development cooperation can't do everything. We all know that these crises all require a lot of, you mentioned political will, it requires a lot of other economic solutions, it requires peace and security, work on a whole other scale than development cooperation. So we talked a lot about all of these crises, but to you, what is the most important roles that development cooperation can play, and do you think that it can sometimes also hurt the EU's relationship with these most fragile countries if they see that the EU is mostly pushing types of investment that very rarely reach to these most affected communities and areas? Anyone want to answer that one?
Yes, indeed, completely fully agree, and that's precisely one of the reasons that under the new Global Gateways initiative that I think you will have heard about, we are not including the ODA that it's targeting the thematic areas of peace and security or migration, for example, or forced displacement, because as you very, very well pointed out, when talking with especially fragile or conflict-affected partner countries, we should be taking into account that there might be much more pressing needs that should be addressed to build on their resilience, to address their fragility, than innovative investments that can be done in a second stage. So that's precisely the reason that our first and foremost approach in this sorts of context should be this humanitarian development peace nexus approach. Of course, development cooperation and the way we see it should imply that we work and that we build towards innovation, sustainable solutions, but that has to start from a basis where we have ensured that the well-being and the protection of these affected populations has happened. So indeed, fully agree.
And what do you think, Evelyn? Do you think that the EU is investing enough in the things that you were mentioning, food, holistic sort of food systems that are there to help the most affected communities? What should be done more in terms of what should be the roles of development cooperation in this?
Well, I think that the EU is one of the strongest donors in the world and really leading the way in so many of these issues. At the same time, we do talk a lot about this humanitarian development nexus, and I'm very happy that all of us mention it, but we also see it failing miserably at the same time. The hunger crisis in the Horn of Africa, we saw that coming years ago, but nothing was done to really invest in these local structures, in resilience, in local food production, in local agriculture. in water scarcity, as my colleague from PIN was mentioning, because food insecurity often comes from the issue of not having clean water or not having water. So this is also why we are always saying people are not starving, but people are being starved, because it's a political decision not to invest in early action and anticipatory action. So we would really love the EU, but also national donors and other donors, because the donor base is way too small, to really invest in that early action and anticipatory action. And I think that that's also the link between the humanitarian and the development nexus.
Richard, please.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. What we see even after the WHS, where there was this commitment to be able to have this kind of seamless movement between development and humanitarian work. The idea is great. The financial structures in most countries are not set up to it. We're nowhere close to that at the present moment. We often see these budgets being protected by the State Department on one side and perhaps the Development Agency on another side, or even within the EU, we have ECHO and Interpart, etc. And there's no follow-on. I mean, ECHO's commitment should be to be driving EU development funding following their humanitarian interventions where we see an opportunity to engage in early recovery. This linkage just doesn't exist. So we're continuously repeating the same kind of short term, then a break. Perhaps if there is an opportunity, we'll be able to move further, but the mechanisms themselves don't really. I think the last part of this, of course, is when it comes to the peace nexus. For most of the actors on the ground that are involved in development work or humanitarian, the peace is a very complicated conundrum to solve. They're not necessarily technically specialized in that. There is a lot of overlapping areas on protection and human rights, etc., which in certain contexts makes it extremely difficult to implement. And in fact, there needs to be a political drive behind this to enable that environment. It's not something that we expect smaller and national organizations are able to step up to and immediately starting rolling out.
Yeah, indeed, and of course made more difficult in contexts where there is conflict or where there is distrust between different actors trying to affect change. But I don't know if I have a microphone out in the audience or if you want to use one of these. Oh, there is the microphone. Let's see if anyone in the anyone in the audience has a question for anyone on the panel. If it's for a specific person, please go ahead and say, or if it's just a general question. So take this opportunity to find out what more could the EU and the Czech Republic be doing to address these indeed multiple and reinforcing global crisis, while of course trying to also reach development goals, which we haven't even gotten into. Yes, please, we have a question over here. So the microphone is coming from behind you there. Yes, perfect.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nicole Adamcová, and I'm the head of the Sub-Saharan Africa department at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I was acknowledged by Deputy Minister Kozák, so I take the liberty of posing the first question, even though I do not want to hijack the discussion. But we have just finished a two-day session of special envoys for the Sahel, and one or two speakers recalled the Sahel region as one of the most fragile regions in Africa, at least in Africa. And in those 2 days, 3 working tables took place, one of them dedicated to development assistance and humanitarian support. And challenging questions, how to carry on with even humanitarian activities in countries in the Sahel, in the current context of the coup d'etat dominers, you know, and there are military juntas in a number of countries in the Sahel, power being transferred through unconstitutional ways, and the donors actually pose themselves questions how to support population when the countries are led by governments that have not been chosen in elections. Obviously, good governance is not also being observed. And it was not only the EU group, but also like-minded countries like Canada, UK, US. And the general consensus seemed to be that, of course, development assistance, budget support would be ceased. But also with humanitarian activities, you need at least, even though it is channeled through non-governmental organizations, you need some level of support from local governments or local authorities. So how to solve this?
So to summarize, in the most difficult conditions possible, what can be done, and how do you go about doing it? And who are, you know, like what would our panelists do in trying to go into a very difficult context like that, in terms of conflict, in terms of governance, and sort of who are best placed to make positive change happen for people, and how do you go about doing this? Any reflections on that? No one. Yeah, Marta and then Richard. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. It's a very, very interesting point, and it's something that we're focusing on more and more. The way we currently frame it is that we have what we call a basic needs approach. Sometimes we have called it as well individual measures, special measures, and it's the development cooperation, the aid that remains when everything else has to go away, precisely because there is a government we cannot work with. That it normally aims to ensure that these basic needs, livelihoods of populations are ensured, even if an unstable government is in place. It's of course implemented through independent actors, through NGOs. It's not implemented through this governments, and also something that within DIKI we've been doing more and more. It's what we call stabilization measures. These are implemented mainly by our colleagues in the Foreign Policy Instrument Service, FPI, it's called sometimes, if you've heard about it. And these are measures that come in for 18 months, renewable until another 18 months, right after when there is a crisis striking, and aim to insert precisely this important gap that you were raising of funding between the humanitarian aid and the development cooperation until it's restored. But not only in terms of financing, I think that it's very important as well that we keep on, as abstract as it may sound, the conversations going on in the meantime, that the coordination mechanisms, the exchanges are still in place for the moment that we can jump back in. We have been completely aware and conscious of the process. There is not this overlapping between donors we were talking about, or this coordinations. So that is from our side the way we are more and more trying to tackle this, both in terms of the more technical financial aspect, but also in terms of the continuous exchanges, so that cycle of knowledge and cooperation is not broken.
I think Richard had a comment as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure I should be talking about this, or Hannah, actually. But Nicole, to answer your question, I mean, you know very well that the MFA has been running a resilience program in Mali for the last 3.5 years. During that period of time, we had the coup. During that period of time, we had COVID. the combination of us, another international partner, and many local actors and local partners that have access, that have the ability to be able to still reach communities, which for the international community is a very serious security constraint, has enabled us to be able to not only seamlessly continue with this program, of course, it always has its hiccups, but at the same time, the Czechs have recognized when there has been additional crisis or needs, they've brought more funding to the table in order to be able to support it. So we're looking at a slightly different approach to a sort of normal crisis modifier, which normally realigns budgets to meet a particular crisis or need that occurs, but that money is then gone and not replaced. What was very amazingly new about the Czech approach is that they saw these kind of crises as a driver for increasing their support and increasing their funding. And that kind of commitment I actually have very, very rarely seen. We have the top-ups, of course, that come out, but they're not as targeted as that. It's normally based on the fact that we have a little bit more money. This was really quite specific on, I don't know whether you...
Yeah, perhaps I would like to say that for me, I think that with growing fragility, we have to be also more flexible, not only in finding ways how to put financial means, but also how to use partners or how to find partners and whom to partner with. And it's one thing is that we can build the networks in the local communities in the better times so that we then can work with them also in the more difficult times. It's for instance in Myanmar, because in Myanmar there was the time between 2012 or 15 until 20 where you could work quite openly with partners, and now again you can't, but the partners are still there, so you can keep working with them. But especially in Sahel, where it's not only the political part, but there is also in the societies now growing anti-European propaganda. So there I think that we shall simply find partners or interlocutors who are able to act in these environments. And it might be, for instance, and Nicole knows very well, ICRC, so they have moved very much in Sahel from pure humanitarian to humanitarian development activities because they know they have access and they have a network of Red Cross, Red Crescent societies. So it can be such a partner, or sometimes it, perhaps in Africa, especially now after COVID, one of the positive results I can see is that the structures, the regional structures are developing, not only in the health sector, but in general in health and social services. They are very much interested in this and also in climate security. So perhaps in some, I know that in Horn of Africa, the IGAD partner is quite good in some of these some of these areas. So perhaps also the Western African partners or some smaller. So then you shall find a partner which is capable of working with again local partners. So we usually use as big donors. They usually use UN as the main partner and interlocutor. Perhaps in Afghanistan now it's the only way through UN, but in some countries I think we shall always know the ways which really lead to the local communities. And there is also one risk, and it's the sharing of risks. In countries such as Myanmar or even Belarus or some others, you shall also be careful not to put the people into problems with your money. So then you shall also pick up partners who will not be punished by the governments, by the local governments. Yeah, so that you help and not put more trouble into the assistance.
Indeed.
I just have one final point on this because I think it's quite important, and it was mentioned previously in terms of 25% of our funding stream should be going through local communities. In the humanitarian sector, this is very far away from that reality. But if you tried to get a capacity building budget line within an ECHO project to build local partners to have emergency response, and they are the first responders, it won't go through because the humanitarian programs are generally too short to see that as a valid investment. And this is something that we really have to fundamentally change.
Yeah. Evelyn had a comment on that as well.
I so agree with that comment. Yeah, it's humanitarian budgets are often just for 6 months or so. And then the money is done. And then ECHO is finding new money, which is great, but it's so short term, and so these long-term investments are just impossible. So this is something that's really important. So thanks so much for raising that. I wanted to focus also on the question that you posed, and you're right, the Sahel is such a complex context with also huge inequalities between countries and in countries. And I think one of the issues that we've seen over the past years that Sahelian countries, but also donors, have focused very much on the security approach to responding in this context instead of focusing on development. And a securitization approach is not necessarily in the benefit of local communities. It's not necessarily taken an approach, a do no harm, a harm approach. And we've seen that that's really harmful for local communities. In Niger, for example, the security approach is very much focused on people not migrating, also not migrating to Europe. Migration was already mentioned as this big elephant in the room, but migration in these countries and in this region is actually an economic strength. But because there's such a focus on keeping people where they are, this economic livelihood is completely cut off for many of the populations there. So instead of having this security approach and focusing on not making sure that people migrate to Europe, which really a very little amount of people do, I think would be a way forward.
Indeed, and I think I had a conversation with a member organization of my network who's had a lot of experience in working in the Sahel and in the Horn of Africa, and her response when I was, asking these kinds of questions myself, but like this has to be such a challenge, like and the securitization in some cases of the investment, and she said something. She said, well, yes, but I've worked in some really difficult situations and regions. I've yet to come across a situation where it doesn't help to, instead of asking what are the challenges, to ask, okay, this is difficult, what can be done and who might be able to do it. And that way you come up with better and maybe some unexpected alliances and possibilities to work together. And you, Richard, mentioned also that local communities, are the first to deal with the impact of crises. They're the first to respond, and for resources from the European Union, from bilateral donors, to be able to make a difference for them. It is important, as you say, to finding the right partners who do connect and have this level of trust as well with communities rather than the security response. Do you want to comment also? You've done some research with communities, I think, in parts of Africa. What are some of the reflections? Like have you done any research asking people what would they like to see happen, or what kind of support would they like to see for their priorities or their?
So that's very broad, and
Yeah.
so many interesting things have already been said. So I feel like I'll try to maybe add some value somehow. The original question was really how to react to a situation that has changed, and whether to continue or not providing budget support or other initiatives. I think the main thing to keep in mind is that it's always going to be controversial. when there is a coup, you always have a large part of the population that is unhappy. A reaction to a coup will also leave a large part of the population unhappy. And that is a problem in the sense that the paradigm in development aid is a bit that of zero problem, or we all agree, or we have a common vision, and sort of sustainable development goals are not about controversies and etc. It's a sort of a smooth and of course, there's a lot of controversies if you enter into the details, but that is especially the places where there is the most interesting one. I think it's indeed what do you do? Do you prioritize the continuation of delivery of basic goods and human needs, or do you think what these people need is that we sever ties with their government because only that way will it maybe fall again and there will be a better one? These are unanswerable questions unless you really look hard at the specific context and situation at the moment, and even then, not necessarily. And so maybe my suggestion there would be that it is important to normalize the non-obviousness, or the not normalize trying, normalize failing, normalize trying to do something and not necessarily having all the answers, and still, you know, being a legitimate and credible actor, and all the more because you tried and admit that you failed, more so than if you try to sort of keep offering that smooth SDG-friendly picture.
Very well said. We have another question in the back. Do we also have a microphone?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jan Liska, working at Caritas Czech Republic. So thank you to all panelists for a very interesting discussion. Now I would have a specific question to Mrs. Volná, because she already mentioned the Czech presidency program. So the resilience and the fragile context were high on the agenda. And, you know, it was interesting to hear from you that how, in spite of Czech Republic's perhaps less experience, we try to be practical and offer the local perspectives. Now, as you mentioned, you know, this program was also built in cooperation with other partners, with other partner countries within the Troika mechanism, so namely France and Sweden. And you also said that that you hope that Sweden would continue the effort started by the Czech Republic, and I wanted to ask you if you could be more specific on that, and if you could mention some concrete points on which you would like to see Sweden, you know, to take on from the Czech Republic and continue the efforts. Thank you so much in advance.
Yeah, so we of course already liaison with Sweden, and one of the topics is we had a disaster risk reduction in relation to fragility, and Sweden calls it anticipatory action in relation to, actually they had not the relation to fragility, but they took over the fragility from us, the fragility view. So they will continue with this and will also relate their efforts to the Council conclusions, which will be adopted now in November under our presidency. So it's one policy line that we are also discussing about the diplomatic efforts in the Nexus, which is also very interesting for them. And of course, we have also other partners to discuss it with, and we hope that we succeed with some presidency paper, light papers, so that they can pick up some of the ideas and continue with them. They have they are very much present also in New York in the UN. It was not only a point we raised in the EU, but also in UN. So there we think definitely that Sweden will follow also with the diplomatic part of Triple Nexus. And in the development, so of course also we have together with Sweden the Eastern Partnership question and the assistance to Ukraine, the continuation. So it's a joint question and quite important, where we still are waiting for the European Commission, because it's a difficult, especially budgetary question in the EU. So just to say these few points.
Okay. I'm a bit conscious of time, and I don't want to keep you from your coffee because we've reached the end of time for this panel, and I think that our panel has certainly answered some questions and raised even more about how the international community can take more responsibility in trying to support affected community in building well-being and being able to respond and prioritize their own development. So I thank the whole panel, and I do hope that this discussion will continue during the other panels, and I encourage everyone to save your questions, because resilience is the topic of the day. So I'm sure there will be more opportunities to ask questions about what is the most important role for development cooperation indeed at different levels of society, and what difference can it make. So thank you all. And please I'm looking at Katarina to be able to point strategically. The coffee is there, we think? There. Okay. Okay, 15-minute coffee break, please. We'll see you back here at 4:15.